In this lecture, we discuss the biopsychosocial model of health, which proposes that there are multiple factors that influence our health. This lecture will discuss the impact of specific behaviors on both our mental and physical health. The three behaviors we will cover in this lecture are obesity, smoking, and exercise. These three were selected since they are all behaviors that are controllable, and they all have dramatic effects on our health. We'll cover the effects of our behavior on health, since there has been a shift in the major causes of death over the last 100 or so years, from being primarily due to disease to many more deaths being due now to lifestyle choices, especially in the more Western, urbanized, and wealthy countries. So we have shifted from death largely being due to factors outside of our control to ones that are within some degree of control. Thus, we are in a position to make choices that will increase our lifespan and maybe even more importantly, improve our health during those years. The first topic we will cover is obesity. What is obesity? Well, there's not an exact definition. However, generally it is seen as an unhealthy weight at the upper end. One definition is being more than 20% over the ideal body weight. However, what is ideal is also difficult to determine. One measure of obesity that is used in medicine and research is body mass index, or BMI. Your BMI is based off of height and weight. This chart shows the weights that fall in each category for given heights. The white part of the chart is considered underweight. The yellow is falling within normal weight, orange is overweight, and red is obese. So if you're 5'11" inches, your ideal range would be about 130 to 170 pounds. Under 130 would be underweight, and over 170 would be overweight. Above 200 would be obese. BMI is used quite frequently in discussing obesity, yet few students are aware of their own scores. A simple way of calculating BMI is weight in pounds multiplied by 703 divided by your height in inches squared. So this formula you could figure out your own weight. So for example, if you weighed 150 pounds and were 5'5" inches in height, or 65 inches, the calculations would be as follows. 150 times 703 equals 10,545 divided by your height squared, or 65 squared, which is equal to 4,225, would equal a BMI of 24.9. The classification for BMI scores are standardized. If you're below 18.5, that's considered underweight. If you're between 18.5 to 24.9, you're in a normal weight. So our example would be right at the top end of the normal weight. 25 to 29.9 is overweight, and over 30 is obese. Now, it's important to note that BMI is not accurate for those who are very muscular. So people who lift a lot of weights will be much heavier. However, their BMI will not be low. So losing as little as 10% of total weight, however, can have major impacts on your health risks. This chart shows the trend in obesity over time in the United States from 1960 to 2008. As you can see, rates of Americans who are overweight have remained relatively stable over the past 50 years. However, obesity has nearly tripled, so that currently about 1 in 3 Americans are classified as obese. What do you think is leading to this increase? Well, we know that obesity runs in families, with heritability running at about 80%. Heritability is the degree to which a trait is passed genetically within a population. It's important to point out that this does not explain individual obesity, rather it is a population measure. Work with identical twins finds that even when raised apart, they have very similar weight. So there is a high genetic component to obesity. However, genetics isn't everything. It can make people sensitive to obesity. However, the environmental factors need to be present to actually result in obesity. These environmental pressures would be overeating. Recent work on epigenetics has found that obesity can be passed down from mothers to children through means other than genetics and learning. Epigenetics is the study of heritable changes in gene expression rather than the genes themselves, caused by mechanisms other than alterations in DNA. That is, how environments and behaviors can influence not the structure of the DNA passed down from the mother to child, but expression of those genetics. Studies have found that genetically identical female mice that eat different foods, one which gets a rich variety of food and becomes obese, and one who eats a controlled diet and stays a healthy weight, have different likelihoods of having babies which develop obesity. The obese mothers have babies that are more likely to be obese. The differences, however, do not show up on the DNA itself, but in how they are expressed. Epigenetics is a fascinating field, and one of your videos this week goes into more detail on it. In an earlier lecture on motivation of eating behavior, we saw that culture and social environment can influence eating. As we discussed then, we tend to eat more food when presented with more options. Think about the example of eating out a buffet. This chart reflects the finding using animal studies with rats. When rats were presented with more food options, they gained significantly more weight than rats with only one option. Think about the culture of food we have now. It is both a blessing and a curse, the number of options we have available. In addition to the amount of options, recall that our evolution led us to have a preference for sugary and fat-rich foods. This shouldn't be surprising, then, that we are getting heavier and heavier. Other changes that have occurred over the last 50 years are the size of typical servings. One of the websites assigned for review this week describes the increases that have occurred to the serving sizes of foods we eat. It is very interesting that what we see as typical 50 years ago. The example I think best illustrates this is the serving size of soda at McDonald's. In the 1950s, the only serving size was 7 ounces. Currently, the kid-size soda at McDonald's is 12 ounces. Accompanying this increase in the weight of the population is both prejudice and discrimination against the obese. Obesity is one of the few remaining socially and legally accepted forms of discrimination. There are no federal laws against discrimination of people due to their weight. Obesity, along with health impacts such as diabetes and heart disease, has impacts on mental health, such as self-esteem and depression. Industrialized nations, especially in the West, tend to discriminate more than other cultures. Media tends to portray thinness as an ideal, with fashion models being on the extreme high end of height and the low end of weight. So in the West we idealize thinness. Is this the case worldwide? Well, this ideal has not even existed universally across time within our own culture. In fact, in the 1950s, anthropologists believed that there was a universal preference for heavier women. It's only in recent times, and within Western cultures, that thin is more generally viewed as positive. Interestingly, this preference for thinner women is accompanied by increases in the weight of the population. Judith Anderson and her colleagues analyzed what people in 54 cultures considered the ideal female body. A heavy body, a body of moderate weight, or a slender body. The researchers also analyzed how reliable the food supply was in each culture. They hypothesized that in societies where food was frequently scarce, a heavy body would be considered the most beautiful. These would be women who had enough to eat and were therefore healthy and fertile. As you can see in this figure, their hypothesis was supported. For most of human history, food supplies have been unstable, and so it seems likely that for most of our existence in most cultures, heavier women have been seen more positively. And this can be seen in the art of these cultures, which tend to present more robust women. It is only in the most recent past, and primarily in the more industrialized cultures, is the food supply stable enough for the preference to shift to more thinner women, who in a culture of plenty are seen as being the healthy ones. So in our modern world, with many varieties of food and the prevalence of sweet and fatty foods which our evolution has led us to prefer, how do we maintain a healthy weight? This is important due to the mental and physical effects that obesity has on our health. If you watch television at all, you have seen many advertisements for diets, diet foods, pills to reduce weights, or cravings for food. Do they work? Well, the most common type of diet is to restrict the calories you take in, eating less food. People tend to have a settling point at which their weight tends to hover around. This is different from earlier theories about set point, in that while we have a homeostatic point at which our genetics settle around, it isn't written in stone. That is, environmental factors can move the dial up or down on our weight. So genetics sets the stage, and then our behaviors and the foods we eat can move that point up or down. What this body weight settling point means is that radical changes such as restrictive diets may have short-term changes to our weight, but eventually weight will tend to come back. In fact, this yo-yo effect can actually result in the dieter ending up heavier after the diets. Some chronic dieters are classified as restrained eaters. This means that they diet and then on occasion binge, eating too much. This binging tends to happen when they feel like they've failed at the diet, and then give up and abandon it. What is important is not the actual violation of the diet, but rather the perception of the violation. For example, eating a large chicken salad with ranch dressing might not seem a violation, while a bowl of ice cream may, when in fact the total calories of the salad might be many more than the ice cream. Restrained dieters also adopt patterns of eating based on cognitive control, following rules such as the time of day to eat, the number of calories, and types of food, rather than following the natural internal states such as hunger and satiation. Beyond restrained eaters are people who have an eating disorder. The two most common eating disorders are anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa. People with anorexia have an excessive and irrational fear of becoming fat. It is also often accompanied by distorted body perceptions, seeing themselves as being much heavier than they actually are. Historically, this disorder was mainly found in the West, but as we export our media, including our focus on thinness, this disorder is also being seen in other cultures. Bulimia is characterized by binging and purging. That is, periods of excess eating, which is the binging, followed by purging, which could be self-induced vomiting, misuse of laxatives, fasting, or excessive exercise. Later in the lecture, we will discuss some of the research on healthy ways to maintain weight. Smoking is another behavior that has enormous health implications. Over 1/3 of people who smoke will die from smoking-related causes, such as lung cancer, emphysema, and heart disease. This is especially troubling given the number of people who smoke, with some estimates being that 20% of Americans smoke. This means that about 6 in 100 people in America will die from smoke-related causes. What is even more tragic is that these deaths are preventable. The good news is that rates of smoking in the United States are dropping. The bad news is that other parts of the world are increasing their smoking, which includes China, which comprises 30% of all smokers, and India, which has about 10% of the world's smokers. This graphic shows the many negative effects smoking has on the body. Many forms of cancer are linked to smoking, not just lung cancer. As you can see, smoking results in damage to the eyes, gums, heart, arteries, lungs, reproductive organs, and bones. With so many demonstrated health consequences, why do people start smoking, and why do they continue? Most smokers start in their teens. Research has found a number of factors which predict which teens will begin smoking. For example, teens with parents or friends who smoke are more likely to smoke themselves. Most people smoke their first cigarette in the presence of other smokers, often due to overt peer pressure. There is also an effect due to cultural portrayals of smoking. One cultural belief about smokers is that they're tough, cool, and independent. Television and other media often portray smoking in a positive light. So culture plays a very large role in beginning smoking. The reasons for going from casual smoker to full-time smoker, as well as for the difficulty in quitting, is the effect that nicotine has on the brain. Nicotine is addictive because it can increase the activation of dopamine neurons, which has a rewarding effect. So far, we've talked about two behaviors that can have negative health consequences. We will conclude with a discussion of a behavior that has many positive effects. That is, exercise. When asked about the benefits of exercise, we naturally first think about the physical outcomes, such as controlling appetite, losing weight, and building muscle. However, exercise has benefits beyond the physical. Exercise can improve nearly every aspect of our lives, including improving memory, enhancing cognition, regulating mood, decreasing depression, and helping in the treatment of addiction and alcoholism. The bad news is that too few Americans engage in regular exercise. In our modern world, many jobs require long periods of inactivity. We drive rather than walk, and we consume entertainment that doesn't require activity, such as watching television and surfing the internet. The good news is it's never too late to start an exercise regimen. While it is best to start early in life, even older adults benefit. For example, a study of sedentary adults aged 60 to 79 who started an exercise program had significant improvements in health and immune functioning after 8 months of exercise. Other studies have found that exercise in older adults improved cognitive function and memory. It doesn't need to be hours of exercise per day to gain the benefits. In fact, 30 minutes of daily exercise can result in improvements in physical and mental health. Changes to these three behaviors can have enormous positive outcomes for our health, leading to longer, healthier lives. Changing our eating habits and increasing exercise can have long-lasting impacts on our weight, which has cascading health benefits. If you smoke, quitting is one of the best things you can do for your health, as people who smoke on average live a decade less than those who don't.